Hello, gumshoes. As always, I'm going to give it a minute to confirm sound, and then we will kick things off. I already have some questions from the last time. Kick things off. Whoop. However, I do want to address this wild uh, development in the Lori Vallow, Arizona case. So, this Justin Lum broke this news, but in a filing dated yesterday, the court received and ordered received a request from Lori's public defenders to withdraw from the case. It's noted that the motion to withdraw was dated October 21st. I'll circle back to that because that's significant. And so it's ordered that they have withdrawn. And the court also received a motion from the defendant requesting that she waive her right to counsel and represent herself. Now, that was dated October 16th. So that request was dated October 16th. Then on the 21st, there was the Rule 11 order granting a mental health evaluation of Lori. That was on the 21st. And also on the 21st, her attorneys requested to withdraw from the case. So even when I heard about the Rule 11 order, I was like, just referring back to Colby's interview with his mom. I mean, that was just a disaster. But one thing that I thought was interesting was that she made it very clear that she is not mentally ill, and so it sounded like she was even saying, I think she started to say there are crazy people who were at the hospital, and then she kind of course corrected and said mentally ill, but she did not identify herself as one of them, which that also aligns with her refusal to take the medications and stuff. So I just think that this is an incredibly interesting development, and on a I'm here for it. Yes, Lori Vallow representing herself. I told Janice, I was like, oh man, I might actually have to go to Arizona. If this goes through, it's pending the Order 11 evaluation. I think that's what it's called. But Rule 11 order. But this, one thing I've said, and I revisited this after watching Colby's interview with his mom. I will address that briefly. People have asked if I was going to analyze it. I feel like there's nothing really for me to analyze. Well, I won't jump ahead to that. But one thought I had when he was, doing the interview, or I was watching the recording, was, Lori, I know from personal experience, and we've also seen evidence of this. Lori is very petty, and she's also very vengeful. So one thing I've wondered about for a long time is knowing that about her. And I've shared a personal experience I had with that, where I just went with her and Colby to work out at the gym that he worked out at. And he was kind of going through, a workout routine with us. And at the time, I was a competitive paddler, so I was um, weightlifting on a very regular basis. Well, he kept having to drop the weights when like Lori would, well, like replace me. So we were taking turns, and God is my witness. Like I just, I would never tease someone about something like that. And I could tell she was also having a hard time with it. And Colby was teasing her, and he either just wasn't reading the room or he was enjoying the reaction, but I could tell it was going over like a lead balloon. And she was getting irritated at minimum. Well, then later that day, she kept insisting that we like go out and sit at the pool. And that's not really my thing. Like, I'm more active. Like, I want to go out. I want to, do things. Like, I would have loved to have gone hiking and stuff, but it is very much like their family was more into like kind of lounging around the pool and stuff. So I didn't bring a swimsuit. And I told Lori that, and she was like, "Oh, you can wear one of mine." And I was like, "I am not going to pour myself into one of yours." Well, then she was like, "Oh, come on. Like, JJ really wants to go swimming and blah, 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 blah. And he loves having you there." And, she's very manipulative, as we've seen. But so I wore the biggest one she had, and I just felt like ridiculous. Like we would just like either sit in the shallow and or sit on the chairs, but I was very uncomfortable. Well, then she starts talking to her mom on the phone. I didn't know who she was talking to, but she was like, "Yeah, just come on over." And I said, "Well, wait a minute. When are they coming over?" Because I was like, I am getting out of this bathing suit before anyone comes over. And she was like, "Oh, no, don't worry about it. They're not coming over for a while." And I just felt really uncomfortable. So I put a towel on, walked into the house to go into my room and change. And her parents were already in the house. So when she talked to them, they must have like been in the driveway. And and it just felt like it was like a petty kind of like, "Oh yeah, you think you're so strong?" Well, like she was just going to like I was less than a minute from her parents walking out and me being in this bathing suit that didn't fit. Anyway, so I'm just sharing that. I've shared it before, but just to kind of set the stage, like that is her level of petty. And and it was much worse in an incident with my kids, but I won't go into that. So having kind of set that stage, she's had a lot of time in isolation to ruminate over all the ways that her family and her friends have abandoned her. Like she was providing, all of this money and these good times and having people stay at her home and all of these things that she thought would like, I don't know, buy her people's support when all of this went down. And as we know, a lot of people were silent, and a lot of people like even supported her and her mission, and including family members. So to have everyone just like scatter, I've thought about this many times. Like I know at one point, I think in 2022, there was a rumor circulating that Lori was considering talking with I'll just say a network, but what I had heard from a reliable source was that her condition was she wanted it to be live, like so they couldn't edit it, and this network wouldn't agree to that. But that was like the early signs of like she wants to burn the whole thing down. Like if she ever granted an interview. And I'm sure her appellate attorneys have pleaded with her, please do not do anything until we get through the appeals process. And anyway, so I, and then watching her interview with Colby, it was clear like she didn't want this to be public. Like she obviously agreed to it, but she was still trying to, kind of cajole him. Like, this is why I didn't want to talk to you about this, publicly. And she was trying all of her manipulative tactics, flattery. You're the only one who cared about Tylee. And, I was trying to get this message to you, and, all of these things, because what she wanted was, restored contact and access to his kids. But so I just wondered, like, how much more can we poke this bear before she just says, like, I don't care about appeals. I don't care about anything. I'm going to grant this interview. So I just wonder how much this firing of her attorneys and her request to represent herself, which I mean, I have no training or experience in law, and I just found out about this as I was like wrapping up work and trying to prepare for the live. Sorry, there are a lot of sirens tonight. I hope that's not as loud as it seems. But anyways, something's going down here in the city. But anyway, so yeah, so I just to picture her like questioning some of these witnesses who she has all of this animosity toward, it's and I heard from one source that the only family member who's kept in touch with her is her mom. I don't know if that's true, but it is a reliable source. But so yeah, at minimum, it's a very interesting development. I mean, if it's just based on her allocution and the statements she made in her interview with Colby, so I guess I'll kind of transition to that. Like based on her allocution, nothing really surprises me. That doesn't mean it wasn't upsetting, like some of the things that she said, like her ridiculous allegation that Tylee, unalived JJ, and that Tylee appeared to her and apologized for being, I think she said like a brat or something. And, just really just ridiculous accusations that don't align with the timeline at all. I mean, really, the only thing that was even remotely interesting to me was her reference to Colby's. Apparently, Colby had some kind of visitation from Tylee, like in a dream or something. And Lori mentioned that this was after Tylee had passed, but Colby didn't know it yet. And he said he didn't remember, anything about that. But, and then that's fair. I mean, I don't think that that's something you would forget. I have a handful of really, really significant dreams, from my, adulthood, and, some of them, like, they'll just never leave me because they were just so significant. But yeah, so I don't, that doesn't track that he wouldn't remember it, but I can understand him like feeling embarrassed. And it also felt a little bit like a shot across the bow from Lori, like, just a pock shot. Like she could see she wasn't getting anywhere. He wasn't going to restore contact. with her. And I think she just kind of threw that out. And I wondered if there were other things which necessitated his need to edit the video. And if so, that's totally fair. Like this is his video. But yeah, a bit from an analysis standpoint, like it took me quite a while just to kind of recalibrate from it because yeah, I won't go into it, but there were just aspects to it that I was just like, what is the point of this? But I do hope that it helps Colby to, just kind of see like things aren't going to get better with his mom. I mean, I don't like the word crazy, but I mean, this is a case of crazy is as crazy does, so yeah, I mean, they were the words of a very, very desperate woman who was trying to restore contact with Colby. Okay, so from there, well, actually, you know what? If we have any questions about Anna, I don't know if you've already been collecting the questions, but if we have any questions about the developments I just mentioned, I think I'll start with those. I'm sorry. I hope I didn't throw off your process too much. If you have any questions, just put the word question in all caps. And I'll just take a minute or so just to see if there are any questions about that. And then I'll move on to the other questions that were submitted. But then throughout the Q&A, I mean, the whole point of the Q&A is if you have questions to drop them in. One thing that helps is if you put the word question in all caps or use emojis or something. It just helps to make it, stand out. And then Anna copies and pastes them to me in Messenger, so I don't have to spend so much time perusing the chat. Although I do love that because I get to see all of your funny, clever comments, but it's not good for like moving things along. Okay. Okay, so Anna Franco asked, were you surprised when the Arizona DA wanted to try this case, especially how Arizona law enforcement made many poor decisions beginning with Charles' murder? Yes, I pictured the prosecutor being handed this affidavit of probable cause with their recommendation to pursue charges against both Lori and Chad. And I really felt for him because, I mean, they just handed over. It's just a red hot mess. So I think if they could have avoided it, I think they probably tried. I'm sure they would have wanted to plead her out just because of the optics. Like, if this ends up going to trial, like I've addressed, even as recent as my last live, and by the way, sorry for the delays. I went out of town for our annual fall Mecca, and then I came back with a cold. So, and I'm still like at the tail end of the cold, so I may have to try to remember to mute myself. But anyway, so I just covered in the last live more details from that case, but I did a live back in 2020 on Analytics about some of the missteps in the investigation into Charles' murder, and that was before we had these document dumps. But anyway, so yeah, I'm sure his hand felt forced by all of the media, the public attention. Like they were not quick to announce charges against Lori, and they passed up the opportunity to announce to pursue charges against Chad. So I was surprised just because, it's I mean, if any justice comes from that case, it will be bonus. Like, at least justice was done in Idaho. I think it was one of those situations where, like, it's kind of like here in New York City, like they have these surprise inspections for restaurants, and they're unannounced, and they just show up and they do an inspection, and then restaurants are given a grade from A to F, and they have to post that grade on the front of their building until they have another inspection. So there are so many restaurants here. If you're walking along and you see a restaurant has a grade of a C, there's very little incentive to go in there. Like, they might have had food storage issues. Usually it's like they find rat droppings or, whatever. It's just not clean enough and stuff. And so they get these low grades. And that's kind of what happened with Chandler Police. I think they were just kind of cruising along. And it does make me wonder how many deaths, how many murders are just passed off as, well, as self-defense. But in this case, it was like they had a surprise inspection, because no one anticipated that this case that had so little visibility. I think I only found like 2 or 3 articles from the day, I think it was 2, from the day Charles was shot. And they didn't even mention in the press release. So there was a press release and 2 articles. They didn't even mention in the press release Alex's name. It just said, like, Lori Vallow's brother. Like, Charles Vallow was shot by his estranged wife's brother, something like that. So, I mean, no one anticipated that this case that they just kind of, like, technically it was, it was still an open case, so they didn't close the case. But, like, I mentioned in my last live, they didn't even, from what I can tell, they didn't even know that Alex had called Lori twice when he told Detective Moffat that he didn't make any calls except to 911. They didn't find out that he lied about that until sometime between, I think it was like June of 2020 and March of 2021, something like that. It was when the other Nathan took over the case. So I suspect it was probably closer to March. But I mean, so, like, that was a critical piece of evidence, but even without that, they had so much evidence that gave them more than enough probable cause to arrest Alex the day of the shooting and Lori very soon thereafter, like within a week. But anyway, so yeah, I think it's going to be a tough case. The one thing they have going for them is that these criminals were very unsophisticated. They're very low intelligence. I mean, that was another thing that was reaffirmed to me in Lori's conversation with Colby. Like, you can tell how unintelligent she is. And I'm really sincerely not saying this just like as a burn or whatever. I mean this like as a serious analysis. Like, her lies are so unsophisticated. Like, she will make statements and you can just see how scattered her mind is, and how almost like childlike she is, but not in an endearing way, in just a just a very unintelligent way by the lies she tells. But because she just doesn't line things up. The only thing that she lined seems to have lined up was she said she went through all the discovery and she actually never used the word zombie. And I didn't take a really deep dive, but I did search what I have that's searchable, and that is true. So the references to zombies from the quick search that I did, they were made by others. So, like Zulema said that Lori said about Charles that she had sex, after she got back together with him to get his finances in order, that she said she literally had sex with a zombie twice. And a few other references. So there were lots of references throughout these hearings to zombies. And I do think that it is very valid because of Ian's the way he codified their beliefs. There was a pretty serious emphasis on zombies, and he wasn't motivated to exaggerate this story, but but it was what he reported to the FBI, so he needed to let the attorneys who would now also be representing him know what he had told them so that they could properly defend Melanie. So I definitely believe that there were references to zombies, but her statement that she didn't call someone a zombie, the closest I could find was her text to Alex, where she was talking about Adam and Zach. And well, it started with Alex asking her what she was doing, and she said something about like looking for Z's. So she referred to what we pretty, I think, unanimously agree she was referring to zombies. She just referred to them as Z's. But anyway, all that aside, I was surprised because it's just going to throw a major spotlight on so many issues with their investigation, the complete lack of investigation, the fact that they were able to just trash the murder scene that night with a pool party, so they wouldn't have even been able to come back the next day, at least like not to collect evidence and stuff, because everything was sullied by that party. But anyway, but I think they just, someone made the decision, you're going to have to prosecute it, because this press is just really bad. Okay, Rachel asked, do you see I think she meant deterrence in Lori's mental health since her Idaho conviction? It seems like she could be even more delusional. No, I think she's always been in this way. I think it's gotten worse because the stakes are higher, but I think she has been so used to just being able to make wild statements and get away with it because, she uses this like fake enthusiastic tone. I heard it even in her interview with Colby, like she was pulling out all the stops. And it was just an interesting peek behind the curtain. Like you just saw a woman who, the same as when she allocuted, like it was like she just still thinks that she has this charm and she has this influence. So, there are people who are much more qualified than I, have deemed that she at one point wasn't competent to stand trial. I do suspect that there are serious mental health issues, but and it may be getting worse just because of the sheer torment of her being a super extrovert and being left to herself, like in isolation for months on end. That would be very hard for anyone. I've talked about the time I passed out, and I just like suddenly got sick. I was walking back to bed, and lost consciousness and face planted into my footboard. And so I had a pretty severe concussion. And I remember my doctor told me, in order for you to make a full recovery, you need to go into a dark room and just close the curtains and deprive yourself of all like contact with the outside world. No audio, no video, no screens, just as much as possible, just rest. And then she was like, if you fell and broke your leg, you would know you can't put weight on your leg, but that's much harder to do when someone injures their brain. But with this kind of concussion, you could have, ongoing, side effects and stuff. That week of isolation and deprivation of just like being able to go on my phone or go out for a run or, go to practice or, just whatever. Like in a week's time, I just felt like I was going absolutely crazy. Like the time crawls. And I already don't think that time goes by fast. I don't know if it's just I'm a hopeless realist, but when people are like, whoa, time has just flown, I'm like, it feels like it's been 117 days, so time usually, with pretty rare exception, it feels like exactly like it is. But in that case, like time just slowed down. And so I've often thought back to that when I think about the Lori and just all of these like months on end of isolation. I'm sure that they have taken a toll on her. And then also, if she has any kind of conscience, and just into the sheer horror of what she participated in, to put it mildly, that has to also torment her. But yeah, but I think there were levels of this. I mean, even dating back to our 2007 vacation. Like there was one time where she was really trying to demonize Joe. I've mentioned this in another live, but she passed on this story that Colby had told her. And I wouldn't exaggerate something like this. Because this case already has so many, just, I don't know. It's already so out there. But she told me that Colby told her that Joe had stuck his head in the microwave and tried to, and she passed on to me that he tried to explode his head. Well, she wasn't saying explode like in air quotes. She just passed it on, as if this was somehow believable. Can you believe it? He tried to explode Colby's head. That's how evil Joe was. And I just remember that really just hitting me. How could an adult, first of all, use the word explode like that, but then also how, that's such an outrageous thing. I mean, obviously, if this was a true account, this was the result of a child who is being worked up into a lather, and and now we've just reached this tipping point where this allegation just doesn't make sense. And you could tell there was no moment of lucidity for her. That would be impossible. Because you can't close the microwave door, but she passed that on to me. This was a fact that she, I don't know, lent credibility, yeah, lent credibility to. I mean, it was just so, so bizarre. But, I've also thought back to that, and I just think it's another indicator. Like she, like, and now also finding out some of the claims that she made at that time, that Tylee was, her sister Stacy reincarnated. I'm putting the emphasis on the wrong syllable there. But anyway, but yeah, so so she made some really outrageous claims during that time as well. So I just think she's always been this unstable, but has just kind of coasted because one, her beauty, at least at that time, that has faded significantly. But then also she leads a pretty insular life, so she really tries to evangelize people to her perspective and then limits her interactions for the most part to people who believe like she does. So yeah, but yeah, I think that's enough about that. Okay, Susie Catherine asked, what do you think Lori is like in prison? Um, I, it's interesting. I, I think she most likely, now we don't have any kind of, peek behind the curtain. Like this conversation with Colby was it, and that in her allocution. But it still doesn't give us insight into how she is in prison. I imagine just from the accounts of people who rode with her, like in the car, on the way to Idaho, and then Idaho back to Arizona, as well as those who were with her on different flights. She was a chatty Cathy. So I suspect that she probably vacillates between trying to be this tough, chick who's, like glaring and stuff when she feels threatened, but then is absolutely desperate for friends and, any kind of connection that she can get. So, so it wasn't surprising to me when she said like she's helping women in the prison and stuff, whether she actually is, like whether these women would verify that or not. I can imagine that would be very important to her, but it would be like with women who like she feels some kind of connection with. And I also suspect that because she's never going to be like in any kind of like popular group, and I shared this once, Janice was at, I don't know if it was like the potato harvest. Oh no, it was the state fair, I think. And she saw women from the prison Lori was at in Idaho before she was extradited to Arizona. And she asked one of them if they ever saw Lori Vallow. And the woman replied something to the effect of like, no, we don't ever see her. She's with the crazies. So I'm assuming that means she's like on like the wing in some kind of wing or cell block with women who struggle with mental health issues. So I can imagine her gaining traction with women who are like kind of more vulnerable. And I imagine like that she has like some level of sincerity, and like probably sincerely, wants to help people on some level, because she's so driven by like she needs her life to have value, and she needs to also continue this belief that she is, chosen by God, and she, God has this plan for her. And I'm not saying like God abandons people in prison. There are really wonderful prison ministries, and people have been known to turn their lives around. But with Lori, you don't see that. Like, she's not turning her life around. She's sticking with all of the same ridiculous claims. But so yeah, that's my take on it for what it's worth. Uh, Mary Patterson asked, "Are you hopeful that the murder of Charles trial may reopen an investigation into Joe's suspicious death?" No, um, no, it's really weird. Like, I continue to, like, push um, the the petition and things like that, but I don't have a lot of hope for that, because I think, even since all of this has happened, Phoenix police has come under the magnifying glass for other issues of all kinds of issues. So they were being investigated, I think, by the Attorney General's office, maybe. But so I don't have hope that this will happen anytime soon. I don't even know that it will happen in my lifetime, but I do have a modicum of hope for it potentially being one of those cases where someone makes like a deathbed confession, or not even so much like the person who murdered him. I have very little hope for that, but more like the one of the many people I believe know exactly what happened with Joe. So when you have a secret shared by that many people, the chances are just higher that at some point something's going to come out, like, and it could happen any number of ways, like that someone may have shared what they knew with someone who they really trusted, and then that person told someone else, and that person ends up breaking or publishing a book, or whatever. So, and then also you have a lot of people who have married into this family who aren't going to have the same level of motivation to kind of take all of the Cox family secrets to their graves, like those who are, kind of born and bred Cox family members. And I think in part it's just there are so many it's secrets. I suspect that it's like, well, where would it end? And if someone comes forward who's actually from the Cox family and someone else has dirt on that person, it could just kick off an avalanche of claims, whether they're true or not. But I think for some of these people who have married into the Cox family, I'm like, yeah, I might not be around to see it, but I can imagine one day someone just saying, I'm going to publish a book, or I'm going to clear my conscience because, like, I've been diagnosed with cancer, or whatever it is. I've just seen those things happen, and cases be reopened. But anyway, so okay. Oh yeah. Condodo asked, "Is Lori in the Arizona jail? Maybe she wants to delay so she can stay in Arizona." She is awaiting trial in a jail, the Maricopa jail in Maricopa County. But the word on the streets is she hates being in Arizona. So I don't think she would do this to delay her trial. In fact, quite the opposite. Like I didn't have a whole lot of time to kind of chew the cud on this development, and it was such a very surprising development. But On some level, and I always do this like Retevia thing. Like if you've ever seen Fiddler on the Roof, Tevia's like on the one hand, on the other hand, on the one hand. So I'm not indecisive, but when it comes to like processing stuff like this, I volley, these thoughts back and forth in my efforts to be fair. And in the midst of that, I thought, on some level, I can understand her wanting to represent herself because, as much as I respect Jim Archibald and John Thomas, attorneys who are public defenders, and I've talked about this before, and I mean no disrespect to public defenders, but they also take on private cases. So you have this balance of like, well, most of them do, so who are you going to spend more time with? This client who's paying, $200 to $1,000 an hour, or what this other client whose case is so complicated. So this wasn't like a hit and run case. This is a case that has so many moving parts and pieces that span many jurisdictions. There were many law enforcement agencies involved in this case across three or four states. So that's just so much information to try to get through. And unless they're, like building an AI chatbot to help them like, process all of this, it's insurmountable. Like, I just don't know how they would do it manually. So, but like Lori knows the case. She's also highly motivated, because like I think she wants revenge. Imagine her questioning Melanie Gibb and Zulema and some of these family members on the stand. Like, she will be ruthless. Like, she will just go from objection to objection and get in as many shots as she can. Like, that's how I imagine this proceeding, and she's also more motivated to actually search these documents for text messages and emails that she knows about, and so and she has nothing but time on her hands. So I mean, I think it's going to be a clown car, just day after day, just, clowns tumbling out of this clown car. But I can on some level understand the impetus. Okay. Susie Catherine asked, has she ever been in total isolation? I don't know that we have a lot of insight into that. I mean, I know that they kept her isolated in, somewhat isolated, but were protected, in Idaho, because obviously they can't put her in Gen Pop before the trial because, she gets shivved. But so I don't know how isolated she has been, but I imagine pretty isolated. So probably not like solitary confinement, and she has, TV, but I don't think she probably, is like in any kind of room with other inmates. I don't know. I don't have any visibility into her prison experience and now jail. Oh, hi, Christine. She asked, did Lori know that Colby planned to put the phone call on the interweb? Yes. Yeah. That she knows that because she objects to it multiple times during the call. Like, she was, and he made passing references to it, but she would say things like, that's why I didn't want this call to be public, because I wanted to share with you like more details that I can't share publicly. So I do, there are like potential implications. I don't know. I mean, clearly she consented to the call, so there's that. But it's also clear she was under duress. So yeah, I don't know if there are any legal implications to any of that, or like someone even made the point that like there were like people talking in the background. I don't think that there was probably anything significant, but yeah. Okay. Sonia Finnegan asked, Lori is very sexual. Do you think she'll find herself a special lady friend? Well, she can't right now because she's in isolation. I do think that she has a gravitational pull toward that. This is going to get a little salacious, but when I was going through the records from her divorce, her and Joe's divorce, he had made a claim that they would watch porn together, and she wanted like to bring a woman in, and she was mostly interested in woman on one woman porn. Keep in mind, this is a divorce proceeding, so who knows? But then, like there have been, other innuendo. Like, I don't know, maybe it's not fair to associate like her, like Melanie's Melanie Gibb was talking about how like she and Lori would hold hands in the temple, and like that could be like they're they see themselves as sisters and stuff. It seemed definitely at minimum, it was weird, with given the contrast with like both of them being so what's the word, supercilious, like so dogmatic in their religious beliefs, and then you have these interactions where yeah. So I don't know, I don't know. But yeah, with her knowing that she's never getting out, who knows? I just don't think, like, I think a lot of her attempts to achieve some kind of moral higher ground, it just didn't pass over to like any kind of sexual context. Okay, I have no idea how to pronounce this name. It's a lot of syllables. Sable Ruby Coco, one word. Above comment reminded me to ask about the story Colby related regarding his mom driving off a cliff. I don't think that Colby ever talked about that. I know that she had mentioned that to me, and but like I've said before, immediately walked it back when I said, Lori, no. Said she was just kidding. She would never, do anything to hurt her kids. But she also told, like, someone reached out to me who had been friends with her, and Lori had told her that years before. And then there was another person who at one point made the claim to Nate Eaton, but made it anonymously. So I think this was just something that like Lori would say, but I think that was more like Lori is very hyperbolic. So when she is trying to make a point, again, kind of circling back to her lack of like any kind of like academic rigor, like academia kind, and I don't mean this in any kind of snobbish way, but like I had a logic class, and it was incredible just how much I learned in that logic class, like mistakes that people make in arguments and things like that. And and so like for people who and there are plenty of people with advanced degrees who say the most outrageously stupid things. So I'm applying a very broad brush, but I'm just one thing that I've noticed is that with the Cox family, in spite of Barry's claim that they were like what the upper like 1% or 5% or something like that, there's just not like much value placed on academics, which then spirals into like you see it in their communication styles. And so part of how that plays out for Lori is she wants to make these points and she wants to be really compelling. Like she really fancies herself like a gifted orator, but she's not. So she tries to make these points. Like to me, the point that she was trying to make had nothing to do with her kids. It had nothing to do with her being suicidal. She wasn't talking about depression. She wasn't talking about anything like that. The point she was making was about how scary the end times will be. So I believe her objective was to convince me that I was in peril, like if the end times came during my lifetime. And I think out of some level of sincere concern, she was trying to convince me of her perspective that that I needed to like protect my soul, and she was there to help me do that. But at that time she wasn't seeing herself as one of the leaders of the 144,000. She was one of the people who was like, I don't think she thought she was in peril, but she was just like much more focused on how scary and terrifying it will be. And to be fair, I mean, there are some really terrifying things in like the book of Revelation. So it's not just in the Book of Mormon, but I think her hyper focus on that, like she already had a hyper focus on heaven. Then Chad came along and put a much more of a hyper focus on the actual end times. So I think that was always something for the Cox family. Like uh, almost all of Barry Cox's email addresses have warrior in them. And I thought that was interesting. Like even going back to like Yahoo and stuff, like, yeah, I just found like a list of email addresses for him, and almost all of them had some reference to a warrior, so they already had this as like a belief system. But I think Chad came along and made her feel like super special in it all. But anyway, so just making the point, like I'm not dismissing it, but one, as a narcissist, and I knew she was narcissistic back from like 2007, but as a narcissist, typically narcissists aren't suicidal, but anyway, so that was, having been one of the people who she made this comment to, that was the context of it. Still a bizarre comment to make, but okay. All right, Melissa McMillan asked, why do you believe Lori blamed Tylee for JJ's and her own deaths? Alex was dead, so why not blame him? That's a good question. I mean, I think from my perspective, I think some people have this perspective of Lori that she still wants to like be out there and, like preaching about this stuff. And she was like eager to share her perspective. I didn't get that impression from this call. but um, I think her main objective was she was desperately trying to reconnect with Colby. So when you work yourself, if I'm correct about that, if you work your way back from that, she had to try to find ways to convince Colby that she wasn't involved, but she knows that she and Chad and Alex were like this trifecta in this group. Like they were the three main people who have been accused of these crimes, though there were numerous co-conspirators and accessories, in my opinion, and stuff. But Lori, Chad, and Alex were the primary trinity of evil here. So I don't think that she thought it would be believable at this point to put it all on Alex, because she knows that Colby knows that Lori was goading Alex. Like, you will be led, and like God will speak to you, and I mean, dating back to 2018, her weird rendition of the song Hallelujah, which ruined it for many of us, unfortunately. But so I just think she had to stick with this narrative that Tylee was evil. But she had to kind of tamp it down because he also feels protective and defensive of Tylee. So in my fractured analysis, I tend to think that's why she came up with the story that she did, because it took the onus of responsibility off of her. She didn't touch on Tylee being a dark spirit. In fact, it kind of walked back like, I never called anyone a zombie, or, like there's no reference to me calling anyone a zombie in the discovery. And, they didn't talk about like her being a dark spirit or anything like that, so I think like that was, I think, she just had years of being able to manipulate Colby. But now, Colby was the one in the position of power. Like, she knew that the only way that she would get to talk to him was to agree for this to go out on his YouTube channel. So I'm sure she bristled at that, but I think that's how desperate she was to try to convince him to reconnect with her. So I think that was like the best that she could come up with, because I still think in her mind, like Tylee's a throwaway in this story. It's just like, you know, um, yeah. So I don't know. I mean, it's hard to analyze the actions of someone who's so erratic. And then also just the duress factor. It's not like they had ongoing contact and we had multiple conversations. I mean, she was clearly, and I don't say this like feeling sorry for her. I'm just saying as a fact, she was clearly under duress and she had very little time to try to get what she wanted, and she didn't get it. Um, Tastefully Frugal asks, did you see Colby's follow-up video to the interview with Dr. Matthias? Mentioned a drive off a cliff story. Oh, okay. So no, I didn't watch that interview and I really have no desire to. But so I guess that's what the other person was referring to. So if someone wants to share those details, or like any kind of like summary or something, yeah, it took, and I don't say this like feeling sorry for myself, it just took quite a bit to recalibrate from that call. And so I don't want to dig into like, okay, let me now watch more videos about that call. And part of it is, and this isn't a flex, I've talked about this before. It's like it's I don't know. It's like I will sometimes feel sorry for someone like Lori, and it feels like it's almost against my will. Is like the seeing her desperation and the duress. It did bother me, and yet at the same time, I'm like, this woman has done so many evil things, but that just that resonates like that back and forth, for quite a while, and I won't go into detail, but I had a very, very unusual dream the week that I was in the at the trial, and I put next to no weight on dreams. So this isn't coming from a Lori Vallow, like it wasn't a visitation, anything like that, but it was a dream that, like, in the dream I had this interaction with Lori, and I had all this compassion for her. And in the dream, I knew she was guilty. She knew she was guilty. And I knew that she was going to prison for a long time. It was like, it wasn't even something that I thought about. It was like I was in the dream. I had this very brief interaction with her in the dream. And it was like, in that context, I knew these things. Like, yeah, like, she's guilty. And I told her, your life is going to be so hard. And she was like so broken. Like, she wasn't crying, but she was just like, her head was hung in shame and stuff, even before I said that. But I just felt all of this compassion. But I woke up and it, like, so messed up. In fact, I was so like out of sorts from it. Like, Janice thought I was mad at her. Because I was just like so in my own thoughts, because I was just like, I don't want this. Like, I don't want to like feel sorry for her. But I remember even like during the dream thinking like, oh, like, it's over. Like, I won't have to like battle with all of these like thoughts, or feelings of like hatred and unforgiveness and all of these things that are quite a heavy weight on the soul. And in the dream I was like, whoa, this is amazing. Like, I didn't feel any of that. It's not like I still knew the gravitas of everything that had happened, but I personally just didn't feel like that heavy anchor. And like, I feel especially as soon as I touched down in Idaho. And then I woke up and I was like, oh no, I hate that bitch. It was like back to reality, but, and, dealing with all those feelings. But anyway, so, yeah, so all that to say, like, this stuff, it messes me up. So, anyway, that's why it's like, no disrespect to, Dr. Matthias or Colby's analysis. I just have to limit my appetite. Okay. Someone asked, did you get any fruitful feedback in your Joe's crime scene photos video? And will you do a follow-up at some point? If so, oh yeah. Like, so that live was, I believe it was the first one I did. No, yeah, I think it was maybe what was it? Oh, no, it was the last live I did before like taking an extended break from the case. But the backstory on that was a reporter, Garna, I always get her last name wrong. Mejia, I think. Mejia or Mieja. Anyway, well, absolutely wonderful reporter and dear friend. she asked me if I would want the pictures from the welfare check, and there were around 125 pictures, and I said yes. And so she, as a follow up, she was like, would you like me to leave out the graphic ones because some of them are very graphic? And I was like, no, but it's not because I'm like, eager to see these graphic pictures. There were just questions that I had, like, about claims that Lori had made and things that should have been on Joe's bedroom floor if her claims were true, and also, where were those photo albums that she accessed, the photo albums from my family. They were in one box. Anyway, so I was like, I'd hate for you to leave out a picture and then, there's some clue in there. So she passed on the pictures, and I put them in Cool Cats just because, some of them, I didn't share the ones that were really graphic. I only shared those with Janice. But all the rest we put in Cool Cats. And the observations, I mean, it was like, that was, that was the beginning of Cool Cats. That was the first, I think maybe even the first post. But, excuse me, there were all these like really brilliant people with eagle eyes, who, like we were all diving into these pictures, and people were picking up on things that I had missed. And yeah, so there were a lot of observations. And then I wrapped up some of them in a live, but it was a very long live. I doubt I'll revisit it because there's no new information. But it was an incredible, it was just I don't know, just to see the level of analysis and the ability that people had to find things that I had missed. Not saying like that's some great feat, but there were things that I had missed, and like the things that they would find like online, like there was this one thing on the floor, and I forget what I thought it was, and someone actually found it. It was an iPad cover. It was like a girl's iPad cover, and Joe hadn't seen Tylee in 2 years at that point, according to no, Tylee had told me about a year, and Lori said to law enforcement it had been 2 years. But so there would have been no reason for it. Anyway, Janice found like one of those string backpacks. I forget what they're called. But anyway, it's just like a drawstring backpack. Like it was something that was on the floor, and it looked like it might be one of those. And she actually found it. It was like a 2017 or 2016 edition, something like that. Anyway, so it was very, very interesting. But yeah, unless new information comes out, there's nothing really to cover. That said, like when these upcoming rounds of FOIA docs are released from Idaho, and then we should also get more rounds from Arizona after Lori's trial, and then, well, after Lori's trial over Charles' murder, and then Lori's trial over the attempted murder of Brandon. There should also be additional waves of FOIA docs, so who knows what could come out in them. Okay. Nutmeg Rose asked, is she representing herself? She's trying to. So it's like to be determined. But Yeah, she wants to. And she does have that right, unless like they find her mentally incompetent or something like that. Uh DC Babos, maybe? What do you think about Colby thinking that part of her made up beliefs came from pop culture, movies, shows, and books? You know, I think it would track with Lori. Again, you know, she wasn't a reader. She didn't have, except for, like these kind of low caliber books from other people who had similar beliefs from her that she shared. Uh, but, she just didn't seem to really have much of an imagination, and so, and you see that, like, even with some of the claims that she and these other ladies would share, like her and Zulema talking about aging in reverse, and they were like getting their periods back, and they were describing them, and all of these like things where you're like, really, like, you have so much time on your hands and that's the best you can come up with, like, even like their inability to kind of pin down, like, is someone overtaken by a spirit of like someone else who died, or are they a zombie, or like, there were a lot of things that they just really didn't kind of have nailed down, and and so I can imagine, I remember Colby saying that she was really into in one of those like chick flick series, and the books, I forget which one it was, but it had I forget which one it was now, but yeah, so I can see her just kind of taking her and the rest of them kind of taking a stone soup approach to these beliefs. But the I don't know, the scarlet thread through all of them is they had to find a way to like explain people's behavior that they didn't like. So you have this, light and dark scale. But then that kind of opened up a slippery slope, especially for those who were on the D side. Like, it was like, oh, well, if they're under 3, I think it was, no, under 4, they could potentially switch sides. So like maybe someone who was a supporter defects, so then maybe they were a 2L and they become a 2D or a 3D, or whatever, and vice versa. Maybe there's someone who was asking questions but then realized, oh, I don't want to get kicked out of this group, and so she stops asking as many questions, so her score might vacillate a bit, but then they had to take it to the point of they have to justify murder. And then they had to justify the murder of kids. And then they had to justify the murder of a special needs child. Like, it was like, so they had to make it to where it's like, aside from Tylee and Joe, those are the only ones we know of who were in the 4D range, 4D and darker. So they were marked as sealed away. No one has ever said that about Tylee, but by extension, like, if you were a 4 and higher D, you couldn't switch back to the other side because you actually made a covenant with Satan, and that covenant was unbreakable, and so so they had no hope of redemption, with like any future lives. This was the end of the road for them. But For the others, it was like, for those who were murdered, it had to be an act of mercy. It was like, and you see it building up. Like I talked about this in one of my lives. You see Lori trying to, manipulate and cajole Chad to get him to declare JJ a zombie. I mean, how he's doing these strange things in the middle of the night and this and that. And then when you said something at one point about, like he was, but like they had extra protection, both he and Tammy. No, Lori had enough. And then on his birthday, she let him know, no, you go back to your wife. I'm just a distraction. And I believe that that was really her saying, you know, like fish or cut bait. Like, either tell me that we are moving on with this plan to eradicate everyone who is standing in our way of being together, or go back to your wife. So I think, they just kind of assimilated whatever seemed to engender the least amount of resistance from those who were supporting them through this. So like Melanie Gibb, Melanie Pulowski, Ian, it was a David Warwick. It was a very delicate balance. And like David Warwick was one of those who kind of vacillated, it was like, well, he's light, but he's a concern. And then when Melanie, had that recorded call and called Lori a Lori whore and, all of those things, even though she was sleeping with a married man, like it was like, oh, well, now you're under the influence of Dave, and so yeah, so I just think they came up with I think they threw things over the fence, and unless people were like, what? Absolutely not. They just kind of went with it and course corrected as they needed to be able to sustain as many supporters as they could. So yeah, and both of them with, very limited, all of them really with very limited intelligence. Colby recalling the threat of death drive. But you told that story on Dr. Phil years ago with Colby sitting right beside you. So I found him suspect with that story to Dr. John. Your thoughts? I don't think I shared that on the Dr. Phil show. I think that was in another interview. I don't know. But yeah, I shared it very early on. So, but again, just given the fact that there were at least two other people and one person who hadn't had contact with Lori for years, who Lori had said this to. So this, like, she had made this claim. She had made this reference to driving over a cliff, even before she met Chad. But it was, I believe it was still in reference to the end times. That part I'm not sure about with the person who was interviewed anonymously who made this statement. That person didn't say what it was in reference to, but the other person, I'll have to follow up with them to ask if there was context for that. But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if she said it to me and I wasn't like in any kind of inner circle, and as pretty as far out as you could get, and still have contact with her. I can imagine her making hyperbolic statements like that to others. But I think, excuse me. I think, for some people, there was so much clapback early on. And now, now I look at it and I'm like, yeah, this is probably a lot of sock puppets of people who were like, it's your fault the kids are dead. You could have saved them. Well, first of all, like anyone who said, like, who says I should have made a call to Child Protection Services. Well, first of all, I grew up with Child Protection Services. I also adopted through the state, through foster care. So I know a lot. I had to go through extensive training to become a foster parent and then to adopt. And, they can't act on something that is just like a claim that has no support. And then even if they could, excuse me, I would have had to tell her or him that they would have asked questions, and I would have had to say, well, yeah, she did walk it back. She did say she was just kidding, and she did say she would never hurt her kids, so it's just not it's just not like, it was something. I mean, it did cross my mind because I did have some level of concern, just because like I'd never heard someone say something like that. But also, I had to weigh that against, if I do that, one, CPS isn't going to act on it because they can't, and that's actually out of fairness to the biological parents. But then I would be throwing away any chance at reconnecting with Tylee, because I would be so demonized. I would be like like her dad's sister who's just trying to tear their family apart, and all of the things that Lori says. So but anyway, so I don't know. I mean, I don't call into question the possibility that she may have said something like that to Colby, just because, is, yeah. Do you have any idea how, in the name of God, Melanie can still have access to her kids after trying to kill their father? Yeah. I mean, I think it's incredibly unjust, but the fact that Gilbert police didn't investigate her, like, I mean, she did some crazy, crazy things. And then she had that whole incident at Brandon's parents' house, and then she didn't show up for the custody hearing. So she had some strikes against her, but then she moved back to Arizona, and I'm not justifying it, but I'm just saying, like, without an investigation, without charges, without something, Brandon just didn't have, like, he threw as much at the legal system as he possibly could, but without Gilbert police acting on it, like, she wasn't even named, to my memory, she was never even named as a suspect or even a person of interest, and so, and, and states are, they're very hesitant to separate parents from their children, but especially mothers. Like, I think that was one of the biases that Joe worked against. I mean, here you have all of these things that Lori said, even with Alex assaulting Joe, within, I think it was like 2 weeks of that assault, she tried to have his parental rights terminated. Like, that's how gutsy she was. Like, she was shameless, and and she had a very aggressive attorney who just kept pounding, just kept pounding at Joe, and Joe was running out of resources, and Lori had Charles' resources. So so yeah, I think that there is already a significant bias against fathers in custody cases. But then you have, 4 young children, and the state of Arizona, I think, is going to be loath to to like have extended times of supervised visitation without cause. But yeah, and I've said this before, but the really unusual thing with the Gilbert investigation is that they did so much more due diligence than Chandler did. Like they went around, they interviewed neighbors. Chandler, there is not one reference to a single neighbor being interviewed, not even the 2 neighbors who came forward. Like, one was hanging out with Lori and Tylee by the car, and another one came up and was like trying to offer, like I think this person wanted to interview and he was just shooed off. And there is not a single reference to ring cameras, neighbors, anything in the Chandler reports. And I read every page of that report. Now, that doesn't mean like, I'm above error, but I did also take the additional step of, searching the Chandler police report for neighbor, ring, camera, like all these different references, just to see if they like, canvassed the neighborhood at all. Like, even just to ask, like, did you hear gunshots? Like, there were 2 to 3 gunshots in a room with no carpeting. Every wall had either a mirror or a window on it, so like and a very high powered pistol. And the decibel rating, like I had shared this in the first live I did about the farce of an investigation, but the decibel rating for Alex's gun was on par with standing next to a jet engine. Like, it is deafening. And so, like, someone would have quite possibly heard those shots. And if no one heard those shots, especially if there had been someone out walking their dog or this or that, then that's an indicator he used a suppressor, But anyway, so all that to say, Gilbert police, they did their due diligence. They interviewed all these neighbors and stuff like that. But then they completely dropped the ball with Melanie. They interviewed her the next day, not the day of the shooting, and they let her bring her toddler, and her toddler sat on the floor, and and so they had to be careful what they said, and they never made her come back, and anyway, so yeah. And then there's actually a reference I believe this was in the Gilbert police report. I've referenced it in multiple lives. It talks about how the week before the attempt, the murder attempt on Brandon, that Melanie was in Rexburg. And then the very next sentence, it said, like, it gave the date range that Melanie was in Rexburg, and then gave another date reference that like included the dates Melanie was there and included like an additional day on each end. So bookends, and so I don't remember the exact dates, but it was something like September 25th to like the 29th, and she was there like from the 26th to the 28th. It was something like that. So the very next sentence, they say, the report says that Lori, Chad, and Alex were planning the murder of Brandon. So they just acknowledge in the previous sentence that Melanie was in town for this little meetup, and then in the next sentence they're like, yeah, so yeah, it's weird. Lori, Chad, and Alex, they were totally planning this murder and didn't even include Melanie in in that list, and so it's just bizarre. It's like like I want to be fair to these police departments, and so I want to give like Gilbert credit where credit is due, but then it's like all of that is spitting into the wind because they didn't. One, that I think their two biggest issues were, one, they didn't do any kind of serious, interrogation of Melanie. It doesn't even look like they validated any of her claims, like verified anything. They asked her what she had done, like the day of the shooting. Now keep in mind, this was the day before. This was less than 24 hours before this interview, and she couldn't remember. She was like, oh, sometimes we go to the mall, sometimes we go to a park. It was like she just like threw out a list of possible excursions that she sometimes has. And that cut muster, my other big criticism is they said that in the in the trial, I believe it might have, I don't know, it was either Lori or Chad's trial. I think it was Chad's trial. Someone from Gilbert Police actually said that they had 24/7 surveillance on Alex Cox and leading up to his death. And there's even a note on one of those days, like they watched Zulema like go to the temple, and then this one night they watched Zulema and Alex get into his truck and drive off. So I don't know that they were really seriously monitoring them 24/7. If they were, okay, then we should know for sure if Alex went to Mexico. I don't believe he did, but but yeah, but like no arrest. It was like he was out, Charles murderer. He was, a suspect in the attempted murder of Brandon. He was, at least to some degree, a person of interest in in Tammy's death. Maybe not a person of interest, but he was coming up in these emails and in conversations as the suspected shooter. And then there were two kids missing, and they learned from who I believe was Brandon on December 5th. So this was a week before Alex died. In fact, this was I think this was the cause for the 24/7 surveillance. This person who was close to someone who was involved and was interviewed on December 5th, and Ian just happens to fit both of those boxes, had said that the kids were dead. So they had that intel, and that Alex, it was at Alex's hand, or he had something to do with it. So they already had that intel, and they're watching him, and they're noting and include in the police report, oh yeah, they were out on a date night. They didn't say date night, but they were out this one evening, and they never picked him up. I'm just like, what were you waiting for? Like, how much probable cause did you need? So those are my two biggest criticisms with Gilbert Police. But I think that's why Melanie still has her kids. Okay. Christine asked if I've seen the documentary My Wife, My Abuser. I haven't. That sounds interesting. Sounds sad, but it sounds like it shines a light on the fact that men can be victims of domestic violence. Okay, so all right, now let me transition to the questions that were I think these were questions from the last live. I think they may have been asked during the live, like, but I just didn't get to them because I ran out of steam. Okay. Ironically, and it's funny because I kind of went through these questions last night just to review them and see if I needed to look anything up. And I had answered this question, and now, all right, anyway, the question is, are you going to cover Lori's Arizona trial? And then in all caps, oh no, that was my answer. Yeah, so my original answer was maybe. I mean, it is very difficult to cover these trials with all of my other responsibilities, but I had always said, like, if anything interesting happened, I like with Chad and Lori's trials, if something that was particularly interesting happened or tied in with maybe some piece of a police report that, I hear it and I'm like, wait, I remember reading something about that, and I go and dig, like, I would share things like that. But now, I mean, if Lori ends up representing herself, I may just have to find a way to, um, at bare minimum, cover this trial. I don't know how I'm going to pull it off, but it sounds like I have time to figure it out. But I mean, I can't imagine a single day not being interesting. Okay. Jean asked, and did police at any time think Tylee was the shooter? No, there's no reference to that. The only thing that came close was Detective Yinklin in attempting to get, I believe it was Tylee's email records. She, and I think that I suspect this was just more of like a lazy shortcut, thinking like, who's going to know? And these search warrants that were in the police report, they were not live text. Like those, a lot of the details in those, especially like the boilerplate and stuff, that was just from reading through the police report because they were screenshots. And I believe that was very much by design. But anyway, I found in the boilerplate, so that's like kind of like the finer print. It wasn't like in the main. Or no, I take that back. That was the reference to the interview with Ian, though they didn't mention Ian. That was in boilerplate. But this was in her search warrant, I believe the main body of the search warrant, that she actually, in trying to justify this search warrant, actually said that Tylee was a suspect in a crime. Like she didn't say what the crime was. But when I read it, I was furious. I mean, like really off the chain, furious, because one, that's on that one, it's absolutely unethical in my opinion. But then also is like, well, wait a minute. So if you believe that she was a suspect in Charles' murder, then why did you ask for her email records or whatever records it was? They were requesting records from September to December. So, well, Charles was murdered in July. So why, so clearly they were looking for proof of life. They wanted to see like when her data dropped off and things like that. So I think she threw it in there just to kind of like add a little extra oomph to it. So they didn't get like pushback, because for some of these companies, they do push back on these search warrants. But, and I think that was the search warrant to Microsoft. I think it was for her Hotmail record. But anyway, but that was the closest. No one ever said that they suspected that she was the shooter. Susan Fenner asked, do you think Gibb will ever be held accountable for her part in all of this? I believe she knew the whole plan. No, I don't. I don't. I think she has just been, I think early on the decision was made that if she got this recording, she would be protected. It wasn't anything that was codified. It wasn't, she wasn't given any like legal protection, but I do think that there was some kind of some kind of agreement, whether she knew about it or not. I think she was. I strongly suspect she was incentivized to get that recording, and that has just given her blanket protection. I used to feel like a little bit of not guilt, but just hesitation in saying that until I found out that they never requested, they never got a warrant for her records, even though she was there. She and David were there when JJ was murdered, and so once I heard that, I mean, I've said this before, I still have the deepest appreciation for everyone who, fought for justice in this case. But, but yeah, I just think she's going to have protection in perpetuity. Except who knows? I mean, if Lori is her own defense counsel, who knows what could come out. But yeah. Okay. Could Alex have held Charles at gunpoint and made him put the phone down? Sure. I personally, I don't believe that was how things went down. I strongly believe he was shot immediately when he walked in. But I said this in the last live. I strongly suspect that first shot missed. Like, I really look forward to seeing the evidence of the round that ended up in the baseboard, because if that had hit Charles, like, it would be extremely difficult to get all the traces of blood out from the wood fibers without like saturating it in water, or what do they call OxyClean or whatever. The OxyClean has to be in water to work. OxyClean removes evidence of blood. But when you're talking about blood in wood fibers, like, forget it. Like, there will have to be some kind of trace blood. So they did cut that portion of the baseboard out. But if there's no blood in that portion of the baseboard, in my very strong opinion, that round never hit Charles. So I just don't think that there was a deliberation, and the main point there wasn't to get his phone. Like, the phone was that was almost like a consolation prize. She got to go in, and I wondered even how they got into his phone. But when Detective Yinklin walked up to the car, Tylee told her the pin, and in one of the references, so sometimes when I find something redacted, I'll search throughout the police report, because these police reports tend to be a compilation of like multiple agencies, and so sometimes a detail will be redacted from one of them and not the other one. And so So I actually found what the pin was, and now I forget what it was, but it was something that was very, very easy to remember. It was like right up there with 1, 2, 3, 4. It might have been that, but it was a very a very simple pin, and they all knew the pin. But so that's how they were able to get into his phone. But at that point, like, they didn't know if he had changed the passcode. So I just don't think that the phone was the primary emphasis. I think the primary emphasis was to kill Charles so that she could collect on the life insurance. Um, okay, Mel Mack asked, in your opinion, do you feel that Chandler slash Gilbert law enforcement failed in their investigation concerning Charles Vallow? Yes, miserably so. Aurora Knight asked, do any of the reports mention lividity or rigor? And yes. So the police report said, I forget who this was. It doesn't matter. It was one of the investigators. Said, when making these observations, I did not notice any other blood in the living room. Due to the lack of furniture, there was no indication of a struggle. Excuse me. And nothing in the room was damaged other than the baseboard that was struck by the mentioned projectile. Based on the lividity present and lack of blood spatter, there was no indication that Valow was moved from the position in which he was found. So, sorry, I have a tickle in my throat. So, yeah, mm, that was the only reference to lividity. And I talked about this in the last live, so I won't go into it in depth, but it was very weird to me that that they said that based on the lividity and lack of blood spatter, there was no indication that Valow was moved from the position. I mean, I think the lack of blood spatter was an indicator of a massive cleanup, so. But then there was also a reference that one of them had made, and it was originally redacted, and then it was later unredacted. Oh gosh, I just lost my train of thought. That's a bad thought to lose a train of thought on. About, oh gosh, what was it? Oh, about the suspicion of the body being moved. I talked about it in the last live, and I don't have the Google sheet up to reference, but there was a reference to suspicion about the position of the body. So it does seem like, I don't know, maybe it was later, like maybe after they analyzed the boards, because they also cut out the boards where the bullet shaved the floorboard. Excuse me. But yeah, so there was some mention of like suspicion about the position that the body was found in. And I talked about that in the live. I don't have any visibility into the trajectory along the board. But definitely, like, the fact that when this is about to get graphic, so trigger warning, it'll just be like 2 minutes and you can come back, or I'll try to remember to wave to motion to unpause, or turn the sound back on. But yeah, there was a mention of the projectile entered his abdomen on the left side and came out his left shoulder. And so, and he was facing like north-south. So, but it said that the trajectory along the board was in the I believe it was southeast, whatever whatever it was. It was like, imagine looking at the wall where his hat was, and it was like toward that corner, the corner on the right. That would be, I believe it was the northeast. Anyway, so it wasn't the trajectory along the floorboard wasn't like north south. It was, yeah, no, it was northeast. So so that would cause suspicion. But then the placement of the round, one, it wasn't expanded. So that round did not leave a gun. Like, I've never believed that round was a spent round. But then I believe it was the fire chief noted that it wasn't particularly misshapen and it didn't look like it was expanded. And I showed pictures in the last live of what an expanded, like a hollow point bullet or round looks like after it's, fired from a gun, and it opens up, it like flowers. And this first of all, the round was totally in the wrong location. It was almost like due east of his shoulder. So it was like this round would have gone along the left side of his body, popped out of his shoulder, and then just inexplicably, without any trail of blood, just landed like a few feet away. And there's no explanation that would explain that the positioning of that round. So there are so many issues. Okay, I'm finished that part. So hopefully nothing else triggering, but yeah. So okay. How much time do you think there was between the time Charles was shot and Alex's 911 call? How well could they have cleaned it? I bet it still would have shown up. So Charles' last text to Adam was at 7:37 in the morning. So he most likely walked in sometime between 7:37 and 7:38. Unless he like preened in his rearview mirror or something. It would have been right around that time. Alex didn't call 911 until 8:32. So, that's a 55-minute span. Like, if you leave a minute for, him actually walking in the door, I estimate that was probably about 54 minutes. So, and Lori was only there for the first 10 minutes. So I think she helped with some of the cleanup, but clearly she had to get JJ and Tylee out. So she left, and I suspect the rest of the time what Alex spent cleaning up. So yeah. And then, something happened to all of those, like whatever they used, paper towels, rags, something. So Alex might have even taken time to, like drop the rags off somewhere. We just don't know. But yeah, they had quite a bit of time to clean up. It was an empty room, so it's not like they had to like clean furniture and things like that. But for Charles to have been hit twice by such a high-powered pistol and at such close range, there would have been significant blood spatter. And especially sorry, I forgot the trigger warning. There would have, especially with where it hit in his chest, there should have been significant blood spatter. Now, I already mentioned in the last live that I had never noticed this before, but the gunshot wound from his abdomen, it the very very little blood had come out of it. So the implication there from my research is Charles was most likely dead or very close to death for the second shot. So clearly not a threat. He was down, he was on the floor, and that wound didn't bleed very much, whereas the chest wound had significant bleeding. Do you think Friday Tie Day, such a cute name. Do you think the children were murdered because they witnessed Charles killing? Yes, to some degree. I don't think that JJ witnessed the murder, so I don't think that he was a threat, and I really don't think that that's why he was murdered. I think Tylee was a threat because, she was just such a, she wasn't just like, I don't know, like she was just such a straight shooter, and and I'm not just saying this because she's my niece, I mean, obviously Tylee lied about a lot after Charles was shot, but I've said all along, Tylee knew no one was looking out for Tylee except for Tylee, and Tylee's only job was to stay alive. And so she needed to do what she needed to do to stay alive. And, law enforcement offered her no protection. They didn't even bring in a social worker or a child psychologist. I mean, nothing. She was essentially treated like an adult. But in normal circumstances, like she was very much a straight shooter and she had more of a conscience than, in my opinion, any other player in this story, from what I've seen. So that was, in Lori's estimation, that was a threat. They couldn't control her. And then she was so close to being an adult and moving out on her own. And then once she was an adult, Lori also knew she couldn't control who Tylee connected with, and so anyway, so yeah, so I think that Tylee was in part murdered because of that. I believe that they were both murdered because they stood in the way of Lori and Chad being together. Like Lori could have just remarried, like she was free by her own devices, but she was free to remarry, and Chad could have gotten a divorce and married Lori. But I think Lori knew, with the combination of the tensions between her and Tylee, and then having a special needs son who she would always have some level of responsibility for, most likely, that Chad would most likely bail. So I think that he, and I'm gonna, I'll go down a little bit of a tangent because it's relevant, but I thought it was interesting how, Chad was not eager to sign off on JJ being a zombie. And I'm not saying that to defend Chad. It's just it is a compulsion on my part to be fair and, as, I don't know, just whatever, just fair and factual as possible. So you see these text messages between Lori and Chad where Lori is clearly trying to get him to declare JJ a zombie, as I mentioned earlier, even in this live, and he wouldn't do it. And so I think that was a difficult threshold for him to cross. But then she very coyly had him fly out to to Arizona from Idaho, and Dave also came in for this event, and they basically double dated that weekend. Like Melanie and David were together, and Lori and Chad were together, and that weekend, that was the first weekend in August 2019. And that was when they had like the really big prayer circle where like Chad had the, the pendant, and there were a lot of weird details with that particular prayer circle, and a lot of the, like whatever, now I forget what they're called, the whatever seven, like they, some of them were there and stuff. Well, anyway, so Chad noted, I believe it was in a text message to Lori. He was talking about the moment like God showed him that JJ was a zombie. He said he was sitting across the table from him eating bacon. So it was a weird detail to add, but I'm glad that he did, because I immediately started thinking, whoa, wait a minute. When would Chad have been sitting across the table from JJ eating bacon before they, went out there? And because there were already indicators that, JJ was dark. but but it would have been that weekend in August. And I think he made that comment. Let me see if I can. I don't think I added it to my timeline. No, darn it. I don't remember the date on that comment, but I believe it was in August. And so that's why I was thinking, like, when would he have been sitting across the table from JJ? And I think it was that weekend. And so I strongly suspect, in addition to starting their castings on the kids, and I don't believe any of them that they didn't participate in castings on the kids, because multiple like Lori's friends talked about how Lori talked about how like Tylee was dark, and it was so difficult living with someone who was so dark, and all this stuff, and they continued to have these castings after Charles was murdered. Well, anyway, so I think in addition to having an occasion to do these castings, I suspect that Lori wanted Chad to have extended time with JJ so that he could see, oh yeah, like all of our focus is going to be on JJ, because that was the moment that he said, whenever it was that he was sitting across from JJ eating bacon, that was the moment he realized that JJ was dark. And so I just think it came down to like he just realized, oh, I'm not going to have my, sex goddess or anything. I just, he's going to be climbing into bed with us, and who knows what he saw that yeah, that weekend that he was there. But he would have seen that, JJ had a lot of needs, and he would be the focal point of Lori's attention. And so I think conveniently enough, he was like, oh, okay, all right. So I've come to agree with you that JJ is dark. So I think with JJ, it was much more a point of he was just going to be in the way. Oh, Jean P asked, did the police do gunshot residue testing on Alex and Lori at any point? No, they did not. And the Detective Moffat told Kay in an email that they didn't do that as a customary thing. I don't know if that's true, but Mel Mack asked, was there stippling from the gunshot wounds? Yes. So there was stippling in the second shot, which was, oh, okay. Well, I'm sorry. Trigger. there was stippling in the second shot to Charles' abdomen that the ME noted. And so I looked this up before the last live to see what that meant. And stippling is an indicator that the firearm was discharged at close range and generally like 2 to 3 feet. So there are like burn marks and stuff if like the person is even closer than that. Okay, Find Summer's Truth. Hey, asked, isn't it common procedure for law enforcement to do gunshot residue testing? So again, and Detective Moffat told Kay that they don't run them routinely. I don't know if that's true. Like I did a little bit of research last night, and I read that it's usually done if if there are like multiple people at the scene, if there's question about like who the shooter was, if there are contradictions between statements and the evidence. So there were, contradictions between, their statements and the evidence, but you also have to do the gunshot residue testing very, very quickly, like before they wash their hands and stuff. So, but they could still, they'll pick up trace amounts of gunshot residue on like clothing and stuff. And as far as I know, I think they tested, I think they tested for DNA, but they didn't test for anything else. Like I don't think they collected their clothing or anything. I think they were just like, well, Alex said he was the shooter, so we'll go with that. But I think if they had run gunshot residue testing on Lori, especially since figuring out that Charles was most likely dead or very close to dead when he was shot the second time, and the weird like trajectory and stuff, it does make me strongly suspect that Lori took a shot. Steph and Sean asked, according to the cult members, where was the zombie supposed to go once Charles was killed? So because he wasn't in the like the satanic splash zone of 4D or higher, the evil spirit was supposed to leave his body so Charles could move on to the next probation. So originally it was this Ned Snyder who Charles had been friends with and died, I think, sometime in the mid-90s. And so the original story was that he was a disembodied spirit and he took over Charles' body. But then it was like they got him out, but then a stronger spirit came in, and that was, gosh, no, I forget his name. It was the same name as Melanie and Zulema's attorney. But I'm also still kind of recovering. But and then the third one was that Eblos, which had like, I don't know, the strength of 1,000 men, according to Alex. So, yeah. So, but yeah, the I guess when an evil spirit took over someone's body, positionally that person became a zombie. But according to Melanie Gibb, the zombie vernacular wasn't introduced until later. So originally they just said that the person was overtaken by an evil spirit. So I think it just kind of became more and more salacious, but which made it that much more difficult for anyone with any kind of like Bible-centered religious beliefs to justify murder. You know what I mean? Like, you can't even say, oh, it was an evil spirit. Even that, there's no justification for murder. Like, Jesus cast out evil spirits. He didn't murder them. But then it's like, once they, I don't know, once the inmates took over the asylum, it was like, oh, well, they're a zombie, and Melanie Gibb even said to Keith on Dateline that, she didn't know he was going to be shot. She just thought, like, it, uh, they would say a prayer, and his spirit would leave his body and he would just die. Like, that's how she put it. And she was like, if he really was a zombie. And Keith Morrison looked horrified. Like, the look on his face was like, they do not pay me enough for this bullshit. But but yeah, and so I mean, that's with her putting her best foot forward, and she was still talking about, like, I just thought we would murder him with our prayers, if he really was a zombie. So yeah, that was their belief. But then if you were a 4D or higher, you just go to hell. Okay. So Jean P asked, I think if any police were suspicious of Jason Mao, or why would they want his DNA? So I think she was trying to say the police were suspicious of Jason Mao, or why would they want his DNA? And so, yeah, I agree. They did look into him, and he was willing to come in without an attorney, and they swabbed him for DNA. So they wanted to check against something. They had, I remember early on, I don't know if this came up in the trial, because I didn't follow either of the trials. But there was someone who was like talking to Mark Means and shared that there were like other fingerprints found on the duct tape. I have no idea how reliable this is. So I don't know if, they were like, I don't know whose DNA they collected to, or like, because you can also get trace amounts of DNA sometimes from a fingerprint. So yeah, so I don't know what DNA they were checking against, but yeah, they did collect his DNA and cleared him. And I don't think he was involved in the murders. I do think that and I talked about this before, but I do think that he was like moral support and all in on the murder of Charles. I just do. I have been like, well, I don't know. Actually, no, I take that back a little bit. On the tormenting of Charles early on. So that was January. That was when he met up with Melanie Gibb, and like gave them advice on like going to law enforcement and things like that. And then he just had like all these weird social media posts, and I've compared him and Emma, Chad's oldest daughter. They were very similar in their MO, in that they both had these like really stupid, low intelligence, passive aggressive, childish social media posts, where they were both just like, it came across like, I have a secret. I have a secret. I have so many secrets. I know so many details about this, but I can't come out and say that. But I still want to get off on publishing, these different weird things, like these kind of cryptic things, like Emma gravitated more toward like mockery, and Jason Mao, there was an element of mockery, but it was more like, kind of cherry picking details about Charles details that like coincided with Charles' murder, like about the Jeep, like looking for a Jeep. Do you know a guy? And I mean, just all these weird things. Like when Lori's bail was denied, he had another weird social media post, like from some, like something from like the Revolutionary War and his whole warrior, weird mindset and stuff. And it was like, the petition has been denied. We must do something. It was something about a petition being denied. And, like it was very bellicose and like, kind of a call for war sort of thing. But I don't think that he was actually involved in any of the shootings. And I personally, I just don't think he had anything to do with the kids or Tammy. I think after, I don't know, I think it's at some point he just started distancing himself from all of this. Okay. Last question. Any idea if the police looked for anything that would have been evidence of them cleaning up the scene? No forensics team was brought into Lori's apartment. Oh, wait, no, that was my answer. Uh, well, actually, now that I think about it, this is, I think she was asking about cleaning up the scene um, in Arizona, not Idaho. So, no, no. And clearly they weren't looking because, how they could see the injuries that they saw and 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 not question how in the world was that room so spotless? Like there's no blood spatter anywhere to be found. It looks like that one round that's chilling in the middle of the room. It looks like someone literally dipped it in blood and set it there. There's like there's even a note, like when it was logged as evidence that it had like, the round, had a red substance on it. But there's, how you could walk into that room and not question, where is all the blood? Like, how is this room so spotless? And how is it that these two people who were in the room, or Lori said she was just outside the room, had just walked over like toward the kitchen, how did they not have any signs of, oratory distress? I mean, they would have had temporary, at minimum, temporary hearing loss. They would have had tinnitus. I mean, you're talking multiple shots from a high-powered pistol in a room where nothing was muffling that sound, So, um, yeah, there are so many things that should have triggered like major questions. I mean, right down to like they couldn't find Charles' wallet or his phone. And like one of the investigators who walked in, he was like, I'm just looking for a fucking wallet or phone or something. Like they couldn't find anything. Sorry, I didn't mean to actually drop the F bomb. I had it in my mind to say effing to not offend people, but that's what he said. But but then um the Detective Yinklin, when they came back to the house so that Alex could walk them through his account of what happened, they let Lori go because she had to pick up JJ, and they never made Lori give an account like from in the room to like compare their stories or anything. But um uh yeah, I mean, my point is like there are so many indicators that there was a massive cleanup, and they just yeah, they just didn't follow up on any of that. But and clearly there was one reference. It was a passing reference in the Chandler police report where I believe it was Detective Moffat just noted that he drove by Alex's house. Like, I don't even think there was a mention of like he knocked on the door or anything. There was just a reference to he drove by Alex's house. So yeah. All right. Well, I am I'm running on fumes. We got through quite a few questions. Thank you for another Q&A. If there are questions I didn't get to, I will start the next Q&A with those questions. And thank you for joining me on another Q&A. Have a great weekend.